Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joshua and Casey.
Thank you. Hi, Casey.
Hey, Josh.
How you doing?
Great.
You're the only
in person.
I know you're the only person that I can see on this thing.
I know.
So I better watch my mouth because other people are watching this, right?
No doubt.
Okay. All right.
Oh, they're lurking on this call somewhere.
Right. So so thank you for having me, and thank you for the Center for Fiction. Thank you to the internet, for everything. So I guess I'll talk about kind of introduce this book, your book, Attention, a Love Story. I think that I'll begin maybe with what you told me about it when I first met you, when you came to do a piece about attention. You interviewed me for the Times, and you were saying I'm doing a book about attention, and I was like, great, because I had written a book about attention and I still didn't know what it was. So I figured that somebody would tell me, because I couldn't after wasting a lot of pages on it. And then we got to know each other, and then I read this book, and there's a lot of different literature of attention, right? There's the sort of the hot take literature of attention, which is probably too inflated of a word for it, which is just really just someone screaming into the void saying, I can't, I'm mad as hell and I can't take this anymore, sort of. Then there, on the other pole, there is really intense neurology that field has been accelerated through fMRI technology that really proposes to identify attentional processes in the brain, and none of them are really writerly, right? One of them has a lot to do with math, and a lot to do with trying to make theories come out of model and data, and then a lot of them just are in all caps with exclamation points. And the belletristic medium, where your book resides, it actually that was kind of barren in the contemporary landscape. And what's interesting to me is that element of writing about attention was one of the earliest ways, the belletristic way of writing about it. And so this book is your, I like telling you, this book is your journey, really through questioning your own experiences of attention through substances, against substances, through technology, somewhat against technology, and your attempt, I read it as at least a way to find out what is my natural mind.
Exactly.
Okay. Exactly. I mean, I think that that's an interesting question, because we don't live really without. We very quickly in our world become alienated from our quote unquote natural minds, and to the point where the idea of a natural mind is an idea that's attacked immediately when it's put out there. What is a natural mind? What does natural mean? And one of the so where I kind of want to begin here is I was thinking that the goal of a human is, let's say for survival purposes, we're in the middle of an epidemic, right? Is to know and to understand things for purposes of survival. The attention would seem to be really crucial, right? To obtaining information, evaluating information, know what's real, know what's fake, and know what advice to take from it. And I think that one of the things that we see now is that attention is something that has been augmented in our time. In the same way that information, in a way, has been augmented through technology, our attentional spans, if they exist, and we can discuss that in a second, has been augmented through drugs. And the book begins with an account of Adderall and attention deficit disorder, ADHD drugs, and kind of goes into an arc into LSD, meditation, other mescaline. We have William James and mescaline and nitrous. And I kind of wanted to ask you about these augmentations, these so-called augmentations of attention and what your experience with them taught you.
Right. And I'd love to ask you the same question at some point too.
I'm high right now, so.
Good. I mean, I would hope so.
Yep.
But basically this book sort of opens with, I got to college. It was the year 2000. ADHD was not the sort of diagnosis du jour that it is now. And a friend said, here, I've got this blue pill. Try it. I can't stand it. It makes me want to do cartwheels in the hall all night. That was her qualm with it. But to me, that was so enticing. And I snapped it up, and it was this sort of key in the lock moment at age 18. And I just thought, okay, I finally have found this tool that I can remove the most profound barrier to comprehension with, which is like my focus. And I never really had thought in high school or before this blue pill moment that, anything was particularly wrong with my attention. But taking it was like experiencing attention weaponized. That's how it felt. And that was the illusion it gave me. And I wound up spending essentially my entire 20s on Adderall and only coming off of it at 30, right after my first book got canceled. And it was sort of like a hitting the rock bottom.
And so in a way we have this control mentality of ADHD. I mean, I do like the idea, which you have in the book, that a lot of what people call the trademark behaviors of ADD and ADHD are really coping mechanisms from early childhood.
Right.
And I tend to side with the Jonathan Crary interpretation, though I have some qualms with it a little bit, that attention is really, as we understand it now, is a sort of a phenomenon that comes out of psychometrics. The ability to measure people's response times, measure how much material people can take in at a certain time, and management theory, capitalism, which is to say, how do we get the maximum amount of work out of someone? How do we give them a drug that turns them into the most productive workers?
Right.
And then on the other hand, we have something like LSD or like ayahuasca, and we have these drugs that open the door of perception. And I wanted to ask you, when you were having this decade-long speed binge, did you feel like a good little worker in a certain economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did, actually. I mean, I think I did, while also being on some level conscious that I was drifting farther and farther afield from the actual work that I hoped to get done and that I aspired to get done. Because I felt like the attention that Adderall gave me was one that was utterly narrow. And it was sort of nose to the grindstone, kind of like losing a sweep, losing the scope of things, feeling. That just sort of slowly but surely eroded everything that I really wanted to be and wanted to try and achieve. So on the one hand, yes, it kind of fueled this sense of like, oh, I can be this sort of Duracell bunny and kind of cheerfully take my place at the office and kind of, sort of go all day and never rebel or never flag. But ultimately, it sort of the thing was that it was only when I got off of it that I felt genuinely productive. And
because I kind of want to square the circle from the kind of augmentation and the productivity of Adderall to the opening things up with hallucinogens.
Right.
And, between these two poles, did you have an idea of what your natural mind was?
I think like we all, or I mean, tell me if you feel this way, that I sort of have this fantasy about what my mind was as a kid, where I imagine that, oh, this was before the iPhone entered the picture and things were, I could be utterly rapt for hours. And it was sort of this like idyllic and idealized state of focus. And I sort of, and I don't really know how true that was, but I think I have that sense, like looking back at my own childhood. Do you feel that way? The sort of like pre-technology Eden?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that I have a conception of, um, I don't know if it's tied just to my childhood, but I definitely still now have a sense of something that I am, that captures my imagination, that comes from me, and something that that I'm interested in because I've been seduced to it by the world. And I also know that that pursuing either of those things, each pursuit of a different idea requires a different kind of mind for me. And I definitely feel that the scariest part for me is really wanting to believe in a natural mind, let's say, but never really having experienced it, right? Because in childhood I was unconscious of it. I mean, a lot of my associations with attention are also associations with childhood, only in the sense of you only know you're paying attention when you've become distracted.
Exactly.
Right? And that's sort of, you only know you're not a child anymore when you actually know the word child. You're like, no, I'm not a child anymore. And I think that there's some consciousness of attention that comes from distraction that's like very much tied in with growing up to me and becoming older. Yeah.
And I think like when I've heard this from so many people who sort of discover these stimulants, and there's this ecstatic beginning to them.
Sure.
Where you can feel like you're revisiting those young person's long stints of joyous, rapturous, single-minded focus.
Right.
Right. And that's kind of the great seduction of these types of drugs.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, and that's the same thing I think with you write about microdosing in this book, and I think that's the same thing with an introduction to hallucinogens. When they're used more regularly, not only do they like lose their potency, but also the occasion for the vision, let's say, becomes too mundane, and no longer, you don't necessarily, it doesn't strike you with such a exhilaration anymore.
I'm not a huge psychedelic person. I was sort of, the reason I included psychedelic science in this book is that I'm so fascinated by this flourishing movement popping up now.
Right.
I feel like it's tied to tech and tied to this sort of, or more broadly, this sense of like splintered, sort of jarringly splintered consciousness, like wanting to get out of that mode and into something that feels more like the present moment, whatever that is.
Right.
And I love the subtext of the psychedelic movement, which is this sense that like, okay, we're not living quite right.
Right.
And we can take like an inch to the right or an inch to the left and be better off and sort of discover something within. And it was those ideas that mesmerized me more than like the substances themselves.
And I mean, I think that a third kind of category of substance hovers in the background here in this book. I mean, there are a number of writers and writing that's mentioned in this. I mean, and I want to talk about Huxley in a second, but I guess we'll begin with Wallace. A thing that really hovers in the background are antidepressants, right?
That's true.
And
I hadn't actually thought of that.
Oh, well, as someone who has my own history with, I mean, I really read this book as a 4 chapters at sequence from the sort of control drug of Adderall or any kind of amphetamine salts through the crash and depression of Nardil, right, which was the drug that Wallace was on, like into the kind of post the late 90s, early 2000s world where we get into the sort of mainstreaming of hallucinogens as like the last gift of the boomers as weed becomes legal. And I think that, and for me, it's interesting that that we have on one hand a productivity drug, we have on the other hand sort of an enlightenment drug, and in the middle we have these drugs that are supposed to make you normal, these antidepressant drugs.
Right.
And I wanted to kind of ask you about the kind of depression that hovers here,
Mm-hmm.
About Wallace's own life, and about your own reading of his work. And one of the things that you quoted in that is that quote. I think was it Franzen who said or someone that Wallace died because he was bored.
Right.
Yeah. And I wanted to kind of ask you about what do you think of for on one hand there's a novelist who can keep so much in his head and
Right.
he's bored. On the other hand, there are people who have this technology that we can be exposed to everything in the world. We can see everything. We have a surfeit of options, and yet boredom seems to be. And I'm not just saying this from quarantine. I would have said this before. Boredom seems to be an odd contemporary plague, and seems in some ways entangled with the contemporary plague of depression. And I kind of wanted to ask you about that relationship between a lack of attention and boredom.
Well, exactly. I mean, it was like, so Wallace is in this book because, as you know, Josh, is that he's he was sort of preoccupied or sort of focused on focus and focused on attention. I mean, that comes up in his commencement speech in 2005, where he's advising these graduating seniors that attention is the crucial skill for getting through your life.
Right.
For like sort of surviving and flourishing and behaving decently and kindly to people.
Right.
And then, by the time he wrote The Pale King, it's sort of like, that word attention pops up on almost every other page in that book, like literally 150 times. And but then ultimately, he commits suicide. And I think what I took from Jonathan Franzen's statement that is sort of like, it was sort of a failure, ironically, failure of attention of some kind, that he couldn't direct his own attention ultimately towards this sense of like wanting to stay alive. After he had thought and wrote so much about the power of attention to save your own life.
Right.
But yeah, no, I mean, and so, I spent time I did the literary pilgrimage thing, and I went to Claremont, California to see his final house, not because it was so relevant to the subject of attention, but because by the time I had finished researching Wallace, I was so consumed by him. I've never been compelled to sort of seek out someone's final home, and I even found the Persian restaurant where he had the dinner that then he got sick from, that then he got off the Nardo after that.
Right.
And it was so powerful seeing these like final streets of his life. So he is one of the four writers that I sort of focus on in the book, but I think he's the one that most grabbed my imagination, and his ideas about attention and why attention matters. So emotional for me.
So, Wallace is someone that, I grew up reading when I was, 13, 14, 15 years old. And, but a person who I only read one or two books. And then when I started reading your book, I was like, oh, I should probably read more. So I have you to blame for this, is Huxley.
Oh.
Yeah. And so, I had read Brave New World, and I had read Doors of Perception. I had never read Island. Which, yeah. Interesting.
What did you think of it?
I think it's, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's his trajectory. Look, different people living in very different contexts and very different times, but in the same way in which someone like Wallace can go from what we would consider, for better or worse, I'm not making value judgments about it, but normative fiction, right, to a self-help, almost hieratic or Vedic visionary sense that's tied to like spirituality or Christian apologetics, and really begin writing things that seem like consolation literature. Huxley took the same trajectory, right? I mean, he ends up writing essentially parables, right, that are almost like religious parables. So I always, I like the idea of a late Tolstoy just writing kind of Christian tracts and then wanting to walk the land. I wouldn't necessarily want to be that person myself, but I think it's an interesting late act for these people. And but Huxley really, fully lived that late act. And I don't know that it's I think the setup of the book, which is, an island with this dying man, you correct me if I'm right, and there's just and these people kind of come to his bedside and just lecture him while he's dying. And they basically tell him everything that he, not only kind of everything he did wrong, but everything that he could do right, as if it was like a next chance to do it. And what they're essentially telling him, and the book ends with this, is attention. The most important thing is attention. And I did get the sense that this was a writer really writing a book at himself.
Like, sort of to remind himself, or to sort of push himself.
To push himself pretty late in the day. Yeah. To push himself pretty late in the day. Yeah, I mean, I thought that there was an element of fear, because he comes from that generation that really, it was possible, I think, at a time to actually keep up with most things that were published and new in the English language, right? And Huxley, especially if you're of a certain class and of a certain city, you could say that you are reading most things that are published. And Huxley was definitely coming along right after that was possible. And I think that was a generation of people who were overwhelmed and associated that rate of productivity with a technocracy. And yeah.
I mean, yeah.
I couldn't get it. Like, are you? I mean, I completely understand why he's fascinating. Especially for the in some ways the most straight-laced drug guy there is. But what in reading Huxley? What did you find in reading Huxley? What interested you?
Well, I hadn't read much of him before this book either, but I always loved his trajectory, that he was born, this English schoolboy, and, at the end of his life, he was this Los Angelino sort of new agey, he was an emigre, and he traded worlds, and he sort of reinvented himself totally. But also his twin sort of passions for attention and psychedelics, because of course he was responsible for this sort of the first great work of psychedelic literature, The Doors of Perception. I are kind of matched two of the big themes of my book, and I wanted to include his story for that reason, and because it's sort of interesting about Island, the novel that he wrote at the end of his life. By the time he'd gotten there, he felt attention was the most important thing. And like this, it's a shame, because the storyline could be, or sort of according to our new kind of cliche about how creative psychedelics make you, is that, after taking all this LSD, he wrote the most brilliant book of his career.
Right.
But actually it was like the exact opposite. And it was like this, it's sort of a disaster book, I think.
Yeah. Right.
And so I found that interesting too, and I kind of wanted to get into that a little bit.
Sure.
Like his ideas are powerful, but it doesn't work as fiction.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting that I was trying to work backwards chronologically. We go from Wallace to Huxley to William James, but in a way, we're also going from a person who wrote, Wallace, who primarily wrote, highly detailed fiction. And nonfiction that, let's be honest, was largely fiction. And Huxley, who is writing these fairly brittle fiction that's largely political or has some sort of manifesto or agenda involved.
Right.
And doing it, I love, the fact that he was Eric Blair, George Orwell's teacher, right, at Eton.
Yeah,
right?
I love that.
So it's like, the two people who are writing this sort of programmatic or agenda-driven sort of fiction, political fiction in mid-century, and then you have William James, who doesn't have a fictive bone in his body. His brother took of it all. So and William James is really where contemporary attention studies start.
Right.
And it's funny because, everyone who writes a book about attention has to write about William James.
You have to.
You just have to, right? And but it also turns out that he's the best writer.
Mm-hmm. He's such a beautiful writer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he elevated this sort of, like, my sense, and tell me if you have a different one from your own research on attention, but that attention as a subject was seen as kind of second class until the end of the 19th century. And it was not something that, like, you would study in a lab. It's not something that you would devote tracks to, but that James was sort of a central player in those final years of elevating it to a subject that it was about, how do you live your life? How do you define your life? And that he, you can't avoid William James when you're digging into attention. But, and Josh, like, how you started your Slim Red book on attention with his famous quote.
Yeah. Everyone knows what attention is. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, for me, he was, there was a lot of inside baseball, actually, I think in his development of it as a subject, right? I mean, you have Wilhelm Wundt and all of these Germans who were deeply interested in psychometrics at the time, Reaktionsdauer, right? The reaction time. And they would put a light on here and then put a light on here, and they would, measure how far, it would be for your eyes to move. Or it would be, they would flash words and they would say, how quickly could it flash that you could retain a series of them in your head. And this was really, this was scientific, study of human perception that would be applied really for, it was pure science, but it was also going to be applied commercially. Like that was an idea. And William James comes from it and through his writing on religion, because he was a great scholar of religion, the varieties of religious experience, through his reading of religion, he realized that attention was originally, or not originally, but for very long was a religious idea. You have Malebranche's attention is the natural prayer of God. And the idea that, you're saying the same prayers every day, but what counts is how much you attend to those words, because that your attention is your intention to God, and then you would be saved. And I see James as saving the religiosity of attention in a time when it was really first under assault by technology, and where everyone was trying to quantify it, he was trying to qualify it, and so I think in that way, it there's one way in which he can be seen as inventing it, the subject, but I think what he really did was he saved it from the exclusive province of commerce, essentially. Yeah. But
it's so funny that when we met, I mean, I laughed so much when you said, that you had this James section and sort of, everyone knows what attention is, but you said, I don't know what attention is, or attention doesn't exist.
Yeah. I think that was the conclusion I came to. Yeah, but out of frustration, sort of more than anything. I mean, I had two feelings about it. One was I thought that attention didn't exist because too many people were saying it was too many things, and I didn't have a better single definition that delimited, a category. And there was selective attention, there was non-selective attention, there was directed attention, there was indirect attention. I mean, it was top-down attention, bottom-up attention, appropriate separate attention. Right. It was just, it's insane. And then secondarily, I also thought that not only was it too many things to too many people, but that it seemed like the contemporary panic about a lack of attention was a purposeful attempt to, invent a resource to immediately create a resource scarcity to keep people panicked. As if we had to keep up with all this stuff, as if we had to measure ourselves against the variety of and the breadth of information that's coming at us. And so for me, I thought it was a way of actually manipulating, of societal manipulation. Did you feel at any time when you were talking to these gurus? I love you were talking. What is the guy's name? Is it the Vietnamese priest? Is it when you're in Mountain View? To the guru who's like one of the gurus to, I want to say Google or Facebook.
Oh, I didn't meet him, but Thich Nhat Hanh.
Right. So did you feel that these people are manipulative in the way that they speak about attention?
No, I mean, for me, it resonates like very authentically,
Okay.
because I am so phobic of this sort of invasion of screens. I mean, and of course, like here we are, and they're saving our lives right now.
Yeah.
But I don't see it as manipulation, because I think probably because I'm like constantly in the throes of an Instagram trance. You know, I even to having written a book about paying attention. I still struggle so much with it. So I think for me, and I've noticed that you're not really even on social media.
No, I would ruin my career so quickly. Right. Yeah, I don't.
Because you would like squander time.
Whatever career I have would be. Yeah, I would not. I'm not worried about time. No, I'm just worried about being my hateful self. We're just talking me and you.
Real concern.
Right. Yeah. I just. But yeah. I mean, I conquered a lot of that. Just a hope for self-preservation, I think. But what I meant was that these technologies that give us this access to other people's lives.
Oh yes, right.
Do they feel manipulative to you? Or do they feel like instruments? Or do they feel like instruments of expression? Well, I mean, I don't want to make it a generational thing, because I'm not that old yet. But I do feel that there are people who believe that these things are, even though that they're sources of anxiety for them, people really regard them as largely, or they can be forgiven because they are great conduits of self-expression, right? And I guess my question to you is the conduit for self-expression worth the anxiety?
I mean, for me personally, I sort of wish we could kind of go back to a simpler time where we weren't all sort of having to be conscious of our so-called brands online and this sort of like representation of self online at all times.
Right.
Yeah. I sort of, I guess I respond like an older person then.
Okay.
Because it doesn't feel creative. It feels, for me, very highly self-conscious and draining.
Right. So with this quarantine, right? What have you used, or what have you learned from the book, right, that has allowed you to flourish in this quarantine? You seem like you're flourishing, at least.
No, what's giving you the impression that I'm flourishing?
Shut up on time.
Well, you did too, Josh.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm far from flourishing. I've got a 5-month-old baby upstairs that we're just sort of just, on the razor's edge of sanity at all times, like any parent right now. But I mean, there are amazing examples in the book that are totally aspirational for me right now, of people like the flow philosopher, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the guy who sort of popularized this idea of flow and this idea of exalted, deep, blissful absorption. That I was lucky enough to meet, and he was in his 80s. And where did you come up with the idea of flow? Like, when did it first occur to you? Thinking he was going to say something totally sort of hippy dippy, like Esalen, in the 1960s or something.
Right.
And he told me, no, it was his uncle taught him how to play chess as the bombs fell around them in Budapest in World War II. And that kind of attention was what let him survive the war, because it sort of lifted him out of his present circumstance and into a higher plane.
Right.
And so I think about him a lot right now. I mean, that you can absorb yourself no matter where you are, no matter what plate you find yourself in. And I have certainly not managed anything like that, but I think I like to sort of sit with his and others' voices in my head, because I think it is possible.
Yeah. I love the chess term for the ability to sit and consider a move. It's Sitzfleisch. That you have sitting flesh, like you know how to sit.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's
in your book, isn't it?
Yeah.
I love that line. Yeah. But I mean, you've been writing away, haven't you?
Yeah. It's therapeutic. It has a certain therapeutic quality to writing. I think that it would be for me to not sit down every day would be to really fragment. So I think that in terms of, my own case of attention or thinking about attention, what really came up for me was that a lot of the neurological and a lot of the philosophical terminology about attention really seemed to me to have psychological dimensions, right?
Mm.
And that that there were these desires or these emotional needs that underlay distraction, for example, right? And that you attend to something that you covet, or you attend to something that you want to be. There has to be an element of jealousy or envy involved, right? And you become distracted when there's something that either you want more or something that makes you feel bad about yourself.
Yeah.
And one of the more interesting models that of attentivity is that psychoanalytic model of attentivity, which really begins to judge everyone's sensoria based on their psychological desires, their psychological profiles. And so in a situation like quarantine, where a lot of the desires have been leveled, and people have kind of one desire of, not to get sick or not to die. In a lot of ways, I think that does change the way that we attend, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, at least, I think that I've come in quarantine to think more about those models. So if I would rewrite my book now, which I'm not so attentive that I'm going to sit and rewrite a book today, I would pay more attention, I think, to the psychoanalytic aspect of it, because it's interesting what happens to the fear of missing out when you miss out.
Right. I mean, they're right. Exactly. I mean, we talked about this a little bit on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
But there are definitely quarantine situations that seem kind of like preferable to my own,
Mm-hmm.
But that's as far as it goes.
Right. Yeah.
It's this profound leveling where we just have nothing we're all sort of in the exact same boat at this moment in a way.
Right. I mean, I think that the elements of attention also that comes through is a person becomes attentive when something goes wrong with them, right? Or a person becomes concerned about attention when something goes wrong with them. That was, Wallace becomes deeply engaged with attention when his depression really begins mounting, when he changes the medication, when he becomes very, very depressed.
So you attribute it to that?
I think that he becomes like when I say interest in attention, I mean some of those sections of Pale King, the boy trying to kiss every part of his body, and elements of his Kenyon College address that to me come from somebody who is thinking he's having a crisis of writing that's also a crisis of conscience, which is he can't figure out what's important anymore to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Exactly.
He's bored of his own concerns. He sees the world as full, and he's not necessarily sure what's ethically, morally, right to look at, what's interesting, what will hold his attention to look at. And so he will hold the reader's attention. And I think he then really then swerves away from looking out at the world. And for the first time, he looks within. And that's when you get a Wallace who writes about himself feeling a certain way. Right. And that to me is, that introspection moment, is around that time, and when he begins writing more about, and you see the word attention cropping up a lot more. In the same way that attention cropping up for William James when he really gets, finishes a large chunk of his work on religion. And that gets kind of put to the side.
Right.
So, yeah.
I know, and actually, Wallace has this beautiful passage that was kind of became like a keystone passage for me, which is like, well, what are we fleeing when we're sort of ensconced in our technologies? Like, what is the fear, the escapist urge? What are we running away from? And that single question kind of haunted me throughout the writing and reporting of this book.
Right.
Because that was sort of at base the behavior I did want to understand.
I mean, that was always my fundamental, kind of wasn't a quarrel, but it was a disagreement with a lot of the Wallace writing about it. I mean, in my mind, I have a section about this in the Attention book, which is that when there's a person or a group in society that is not complying, right? They are always accused of being distracted, right? It's, the distracted state of the colonies is what, King George III said. It's, the distraction of the Union, on the eve of Civil War. It's, the women in Salem were distracted into witchcraft. And I always saw that idea of distraction as an accusation leveled by someone or something in power against someone who has less power, who's not doing what's expected of them. And in a way, I see distraction as a fundamentally, non-compliant expression of personal freedom. I refuse to pay attention to what you say to pay attention to, because I am a free person. And it's that aspect, I think, of distraction that's lost in the discussion of the contemporary attention economy. Don't you have moments like that where you say, like, I'm going to be distracted by this because?
Yes, like it's a sort of proud act of resistance.
Yeah, I think so. Which in itself can be dangerous. I mean, I think I'm certainly practicing that with regard to the president now, and that might not be the right thing to do. I mean, but the idea that one must attend to something and then the refusal to do it, I think is for me, is an immemorial political act. It goes back to probably its greatest writer is Thoreau, and it has much deeper roots than that. So I always thought that the contemporary binary of distraction being not good, it's sort of like, well, not good for who? So should we take some questions from an audience?
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
we have to press. What do we have to do? We have to do this thing. Do we get that? So I will read this.
Great.
You can see this, right?
I can't see.
So the question is from Marie. Is with regard to attention drilling down on the other side, can it be that we have so much calling our attention, but what is the lack or inability to make sense of all this information or stimulus that hampers us? Is that attention? As if we are missing a next step. What you said about Wallace, the filter system is off, the introspective moment. Perhaps what is missing is the disconnect between attention and introspection. So I think what she's asking is where does attention end and introspection begin? And vice versa, and why is there a disconnect between the two?
Oh, in that sense, is she implying that attention is like outward focused?
I think the neurologists will call it exogamous attention versus endogamous. Yeah, right, probably.
Says, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I actually think that more of our attention is inward, is aimed internally than it is at the outside world. And then actually more of our distraction comes up internally than from the outside world as well. It's not just our iPhones, right? It's that horrible monologue in our heads at all times,
right,
that can sort of consume us even when we don't want to be. So I don't see introspection and attention as opposed at all. Right.
I mean, I think there's all this. I mean, this is one of the things that I'm sure you found in the literature. I mean, you have a lot of this here. Is that there's attention that is self-directed outward, saying I want to pay attention to this. Then there's the attention that is a stimulus outside that compels you to look, like a loud explosion or like come over here, and you go. And then there's the negotiation between self-willed attention and compelled attention. And each one of these things, when they devise experiments to figure out if different parts of the brain are stimulated, they see different things happening in the brain. And so then they say, well, compelled attention is really when this part communicates with this part, and exogenous attention is this, and endogenous attention is this. And it becomes so compartmentalized in a way that that when I was doing research for my book, I was looking at this and I was saying, I don't know whether I wanted to pay attention to that or this wanted me to pay attention to it. It's just like I don't know. Like I can't say, or I'll give you two different answers depending on what day it is.
Right. Or what minute.
Right. And I think that that one of the interesting things about your book is that, and that kind of only this sort of belletristic account can do is it doesn't it just takes in every argument and flows through them. And I think that's sort of the only way that we can deal with this science,
And actually, like I'd sort of delved deeply into neuroscience in my first book, and purposefully didn't want to do that with this one, because I kind of felt like it's interesting, but it doesn't move me that much in terms of helping me think about something so rich like attention in a funny way for the reasons that you were sort of describing.
I'm going to ask this next question. Where is this? I love this. These questions get votes from other people about how much people want people to ask these questions.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Wondering if you have any thoughts on the moral dimensions of attention and technology. Have the ways that our attention has changed with technology been developments that are good or bad?
And who asked that?
A person with the same name as me, who is not me, Josh.
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so hard to generalize, right? Because we're connected to one another now, having this conversation, and we're all together, able to engage together. So it's not. I wouldn't want to make sort of a blanket Luddite pronouncement. But I think about Twitter, which is kind of like I'm never as depressed as when I'm on Twitter. Like it's the most toxic of all the platforms, and I feel like this. I see that it promotes this instantaneous sort of dismissing of people based on such a tiny amount of information. Like we don't have time, we don't have attentional capacity to sort of dwell in ambiguity and consider someone in all of their complexity. It's like I think that's the kind of thinking it encourages, which is just sort of kind of cancel one person and declare another sort of sacrosanct, and there's all the humanness gets in the middle gets lost, and that middle ground is what I cherish and where I want to dwell and what I want to preserve. And I feel like it's harder and harder to do that on so many of these technology platforms.
You're talking about your father too, correct?
I guess so.
Okay.
But I feel like it might be a little late in the conversation to get into that.
Buy the book. buy the book. So we have one here. I think Lacey. Lacey asked Casey. Casey, you said you never truly felt productive until you were off Adderall. Can you speak to what that means, and what, if any, way your writing changed during the transition and post-medication?
It's so obvious in a way, because I mean, the fact is, like, I never knew how I felt when I was on Adderall. Like, I never knew how I genuinely felt about anything because I was in a completely artificial state. So I truly, to this day, don't see how sort of when you're taking tons of speed, how are you imbuing your sentences with true, authentic feeling and meaning? And Josh, like, I'd love to hear, because I know that you've dabbled too. I mean, is that true for you, or?
I mean, I've never done it as like I don't want to say I've never been addicted to it, because definitely when I stopped doing it, then you miss it for a little bit. But I was never on it for a sustained period that of years, right? And so, because for me, I think that the tolerance that I developed to any drug makes me feel, makes me have to up a dosage to feel that same way very quickly. And for me, the great hit of it was to take something like that after not taking it for a while, right? Then you feel its effect, right? And it wakes you up. I think I know for a fact that I never knew how I felt before I did any drugs anyway. and that I was capable of convincing myself that I felt one way or the other, kind of any day of the week, you know, or any minute. I tend to be very I tend to be very wary of these things. I also tend to be wary, really, of antidepressants as well, and I only really see things in retrospect that where, for me, periods of depression or periods of drugs and tend to coexist, and that and the writing is always bad during those periods. You know, I think because, like, the trough of the soul, you know, and so
right.
But, you know, I think that of all the problems that I've ever had with anything, the thing that has been the least helpful of my writing and the least helpful to my life has been cigarettes, which are the most impossible to quit.
You think cigarettes have affected your writing?
Yes, I do, actually. I do. Yeah.
How so?
I think that I think that there's like a rhythm of thought that comes with smoking. You know, I think like each one of my paragraphs is a cigarette long.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes I'm really suspicious that that's the case. But yeah. Let's. Where are we? We have a lot of questions here.
Maybe we'll just do like two more.
We'll just do two more. Okay.
I think so. Unless, yeah.
Let's do. I like this one. This is a pretty. What do you think of the trendiness of mindfulness?
Yeah. It's not a topic I dove into in the book, in part because I'm not that attracted to the trendiness of mindfulness. And
it's a little mindfulness in the book, or am I just so uncool that I thought it was mindfulness?
Which part?
Well, I thought, like, in the Silicon Valley stuff, and you were speaking to like the ethical designer and Tristan, and you were talking about that guru, that there was some mind, but that's not. That's not
no. I
don't even know what the trend of mindfulness is.
I think this sort of like Esalen, sort of everyone, you know, the sort of West Coast, that mindfulness is somehow, and that anything that you could eat chocolate and mindfully, that mindfulness can be inserted into kind of like such a wide range of sort of what used to just be like eating chocolate. You know what I mean? It's sort of, it's almost lost its meaning because it's used in such a loose way. But no, I think, Josh, the scene you're thinking of is this poignant moment in the book, or like the story I heard. Tristan Harris, the ex-Google guy who became sort of a whistleblower for how addictive these technologies are, told Ezra Klein on Ezra Klein's podcast the story of inviting Thich Nhat Hanh to the Mountain View campus. You know, this amazing monk and author. And sort of on one side of his conference table were like 8 monks in saffron robes, and on the other was like sort of, you know, 6 Gmail employees. And Thich Nhat Hanh said, like, please come to Plum Village and meditate with me.
Right.
You know, and he's very concerned about technology, and I think he wanted to offer some kind of, he felt this could be some kind of way of changing or deepening the way that our technology is.
Yeah.
And Tristan Harris observed that, you know, nobody went. And I just sort of thought, but like, it was funny to me because that was the exact same mindfulness retreat where David Foster Wallace had gone, you know, like 15 years before, and left early.
Because the food was bad.
Or so he said.
That's what he said. Yeah.
I sympathize with that because I could imagine myself arriving in Plum Village and like leaving immediately.
I mean, I would never go. I mean, I think that the, you know, one thing that I always thought was interesting is that the mindfulness was just this sort of, or what I understood to be mindfulness was just the compensatory mechanism for the cruelty of technology. People saw actually how cruelly technology could be used, how it can be used to surveil people, to monitor people, how it can be used to, control their time and their mind, right? And also how it could be a conduit for people being mean, right? And for just, for hate speech, for accusations, for revenge porn, for the worst sort of impulses, people. And I think that there had to be some sort of countervailing movement, right, to kind of wean us from that. And I don't know that mindfulness is, mindfulness ended up being that kind of, unconscious counterbalance that the culture offered, but I don't think it's the right one, or it doesn't feel like the right one. But I'm just trying to give my responses mindfully. All right, we will do one more. So here, there's been a lot of conversation about how girls and women may experience ADHD differently from men. They are less hyperactive and more dreamy, and also that they have problems after they leave the scheduled world of school. This suggests our ideas of attention may be shaped too much by ideas about the importance of paying attention in school. Or any thoughts from either of you about gendered ideas about attention?
Well, that's interesting. Well, what do you think? I mean, don't you think that the sort of that old school scholastic monk model is inherently very male? That like sitting for hours and
monks are male, sure, yeah,
right.
Yeah. I mean, as a dreamy boy myself, I'm not going to defend my entire gender, but like I had a hard time caring what people said, but that wasn't because my attention was fractured. This is because I thought they were full of shit and I was bored. I don't know. But I think this person is asking about, correct me if I'm wrong, but the diagnostics of it.
Like the hyperactivity facet versus the sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not really sure how to answer.
I mean, I definitely think that like so much of the, so much of religious literature, of course, is male, right? But of the written religious literature, so much of it is about attentivity. I mean, you have, also your book has a beautiful section about Simone Weil in it. That really does kind of hold her up as an extreme model of attentivity that is very far from being dreamy, right?
Yeah.
That could like this as far as you could possibly get from being dreamy.
She was not particularly dreamy. No,
she wasn't floating. No, and I think that so yeah, I'm not sure, but I never do well on questions of gender. So I have one more question because I think we're just at the hour, or you were getting cut off. Hello.
No, please ask your question.
Oh yeah. I want to say, what are you? I know you said kid. Are you moving soon? But what went into neurology with the first thing, and then really with attention, you kind of went through your story of both attention, but your story of your experience essentially becoming a writer, right? And becoming a writer against a world of substances and technology. What are you doing next?
God, I wish I could answer. I'm like so drawn for some reason to the subject of California. I don't know exactly why, if it's because it sort of feels apocalyptic, sort of appropriately apocalyptic right now.
Right.
But we're in survival mode here.
Yeah.
For the moment.
Okay. Survival mode and then California. Okay, good.
Hopefully.
Okay. Sounds good.
Hopefully.